Well, Dr. Moss, I want to first just thank you and just appreciation for your life, for your work, and for your ministry, in particular for sitting down with you to have this interview. You have so much wisdom and so much to share that we just thought we needed to get you on camera just to talk about your experiences. So the subject that we're talking about is prophetic preaching. So I'd like for you just to, if you could, for the audience, most of our audience knows you, but just in case there's a couple of people that do not know who Otis Moss Jr., there are only a few people like that in the country, but just in case, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then what is prophetic preaching?
To begin with, I grew up in a small town in Georgia, a few miles out from LaGrange, Georgia, which is about 65 miles from Atlanta, on a farm. My father was a sharecropper. Our mother died at a very early age, leaving 5 siblings, 5 children. Our father became a single parent in the midst of all of these minor children, never remarried, but struggled to hold the family together. Later on, when I was 16, our father was killed in an automobile accident. But we kept striving, struggling. My older sisters migrated to Michigan. My younger sister joined the Air Force, and that provided a platform for her college education. And I went on to college on a crust of bread and a glass of water. And entered the ministry at an early age. My entering year at Morehouse, entered the pastorate. Sometimes some might think too early, and I don't disagree. But I cannot remember when I was not conscious of the civil rights movement, the injustice, the segregation, the racism, and had a growing determination to try to do something about it, to be a part of the struggle. And that has been my ministry, my life's work. The proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ to me is commitment to justice.
Tell us about your work with Dr. King. That was a very instrumental part of your life, so tell us about that.
My freshman year at Morehouse, this was following Dr. King's graduation and his movement into seminary and graduate school, I met the King family. Dr. Martin Luther King Sr. was the pastor of the Ebenezer Baptist Church, well known, a graduate of Morehouse, class of 31, and so was Dr. King's maternal grandfather, the first president of the Atlanta NAACP back in the early 1900s, shortly after the NAACP was founded. I became acquainted with the King family before I met Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Became acquainted with his younger brother, A.D. Williams King, the Reverend A.D. Williams King, and of course Dr. King was an outstanding leader in the Atlanta community and the nation, particularly in the Baptist circles and religious circles. And based on that, I met Dr. King personally in 1955, a few months before the beginning of the Montgomery movement. As a matter of fact, it was at a National Baptist Convention session when the whole discussion, the pulpit, the formal and informal conversations were about the lynching of Emmett Till. So you might say we met in a conversation concerning justice and injustice. From that moment, the acquaintance grew the friendship grew, and eventually an involvement in his work, his life's work, and he became, for my generation, our moral leader.
So how would you sum up, if you had a couple sentences to sum up his work, there's so much interpretation about his work, how would you sum it up?
I would agree with the introduction of A. Philip Randolph. On one occasion, he said, Martin Luther King Jr., the moral leader of our nation. For a few fleeting moments, a few fleeting years, he was the moral leader. What A. Philip Randolph said, I think it was 1957 when I first heard that statement. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel summed up eloquently and profoundly 10 days before Dr. King's assassination, when he introduced him at a congregation of rabbis in New York State. Rabbi Heschel, who had been a part of the Selma March, Rabbi Heschel said, Martin Luther King Jr. is a voice, a vision, and a way. I call upon every Jew to hearken his voice, share his vision, and follow his way. The very future of our nation is dependent upon the impact and influence of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
So would you say that Dr. King, and hence yourself, was he doing prophetic preaching?
I never heard him speak or preach when the prophetic theme, principle, paradigm, when these things were not present. And that prophetic preaching is the proclamation of truth connected with action, even at great risks. Prophetic preaching is proclaiming, from our perspective, proclaiming truth with love, with a view toward redemption and transformation. And this was his life's work. This was the risk. And the risk involved, on the one hand, it can generate admiration. On the other hand, it can generate hate. And the intent of hurt toward the proclaimer, he experienced all of those.
So say a little bit more about that, because one of the questions that I wanted to ask you was, can you preach prophetically and be popular?
Once in a while, the two might unite, but not for long. Popularity and prophetic preaching are not easy companions. They are often antithetical. The prophet is not tied to popularity. The prophet is committed to redemption, truth, liberation, and reconciliation.
So is it possible to grow a ministry with prophetic preaching?
It is. It is possible to grow a ministry with prophetic preaching, but one must be prepared for service, suffering, and transformation.
So one of the concerns is, where in the Bible is prophetic preaching? Or, do you have favorite examples? Because, we want to do biblical preaching, and some people do biblical preaching, but prophetic preaching is nowhere in there.
You're absolutely right, and much to our pain. My favorite Hebrew scriptures for prophetic preaching is found in the 8th century prophets. If you take the 8th century prophets and Jesus, you have the foundation for generations of prophetic preaching. Look at Amos, Hosea, Isaiah, and Micah. And the interesting thing about this is when you connect these, you cannot leave out Moses. For Jesus talked about the law and the prophets. So Moses is an example of living prophetic proclamation and leadership. The 8th century prophets, to me, are examples of the proclamation, the teaching of, and the doing of prophetic preaching. And Jesus is an example of the living Word, the Word that became flesh. And wherever we see Jesus, and wherever you meet Jesus, you're bound to bump into, whether you want to or not, the actualization of prophetic preaching.
So after the most recent election, there are a lot of us who are grappling with what to preach, and how to preach prophetically. What would you offer to us as prophetic preaching, given where we are as a nation right now?
I would say that this is a great moment, really a necessary moment for prophetic preaching. It ought to pull from us the best of preaching. This is a great preaching hour, not because it's popular, not because it's necessarily safe, not because it will get you a lot of awards or maybe even a lot of invitations, but it is that moment in history that cries out for prophetic preaching and redemptive action. One of my troubling moments following this election on November 9th, I had to struggle with something our parents, foreparents and ancestors often said in their prayers: Lord, teach me how to pray and what to pray for. And November 9th, early morning of November 9th, I had to struggle with how now do I pray for us? How do I pray now for Hillary and Trump? That's a challenge, but it has to be done. So you can go to Calvary and get an example. When you look at Jesus on the cross, the first prayer and the first sermon on Calvary was directed to God in behalf of his enemies. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And isn't it remarkable that in that crucifying moment, Jesus prayed for the crucifiers. Now, that's a call and a challenge.
Yes.
And we are called to do that, I believe, in this very hour. And if we are able to do that, then we are prepared not just for Friday, or that bereaving Saturday, but it leads to Sunday morning.
Mm-hmm. So have you preached since the election?
Yes, I have.
And would you give us the benefit of what you preached?
Well, 2 or 3 instances. In one situation, I talked about the 3 A's of spiritual engagement: mm-hmm. agony, assurance, and affirmation. Mm-hmm. And I did something which might be unhomiletical. And talking to a professor of homiletics, one whom I greatly admire and respect.
You're kind.
And thanks for your leadership. But in this, I looked at 3 Psalms, the 22nd, the 23rd, and the 24th. Mm-hmm. My God, why hast thou forsaken us? I think that's a pretty good start for November 9th. But you cannot become entrapped in the zone of agony. Mm-hmm. Move to Psalm 23. Mm-hmm. The Lord is my shepherd. Yeah. I shall not want. Mm-hmm. I shall not want for truth. I shall not want for courage. I shall not want for a word in a wordless circumstance. And God prepares a table in the presence of our enemies. I had a conversation with our friend Dr. Johnny Youngblood some years ago, and we talked about the fact that we often focus too much on the enemy and not enough on the table. Thou preparest a table. Yeah. And we can miss the table focusing on the opposition in the presence of my enemies. Yea, though I walk through the valley, and I grew up in the country where there were many valleys and mountains and hills. But if you grew up in an urban setting and you don't know anything about valleys, just drop the V. Yea, though I walk through the alleys of Chicago, Cleveland, Detroit, New York, St. Louis, Ferguson, and all of the other places close by and far away, I will fear no evil. A faith that cannot stand up under Trump is a faith too shallow, too temporary. Our faith must be more than Trump shallow. It must be deep enough for the storms, for the winter season, for the famine. That's the kind of prophetic preaching I think we ought to engage in and seek to pass on to coming generations.
Yesterday we had a conversation about mourning, and you made some very profound comments yesterday about the mourning that did not get done post King's assassination. So let's open that up, because I would like for our viewers to really, you were absolutely profound in your thinking about this. So let's talk about that for a little bit.
I think of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as an incident in history that created the bereavement of a movement. Mm-hmm. The whole movement went into bereavement. And as a pastor, you are familiar with those various stages. Some say 6, some say 7, some say 10. Mm-hmm. The stages of bereavement, one of which is hostility, mm-hmm. one of which is withdrawal. Another phase is the inability to concentrate on anything except what we consider to be that which is lost. Mm-hmm. Now, it's possible to get trapped in any of those stages. We went through all of them. Mm-hmm. And they don't last for an hour. Mm-hmm. This bereavement stage can sometimes take years and decades. Mm-hmm. Someone said that it took our nation a century to overcome or to adequately grapple with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Mm-hmm. We are approaching a half century since the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., and we're still in grief. Mm-hmm. We can feel it in so many ways. And I think in retrospect, we did not take the time to go to the upper room and listen and pray and fast and receive the orders for the next phase. And because we did not do that, and I intentionally use the collective we missed a lot of opportunities. We made some awkward moves. We also did some great things. A generation grew out of that movement that has served our nation well. But we are not finished with the assassination. The question is still troubling us. Where do we go from here? Mm-hmm. And there is a colon, chaos or community. We are well acquainted with the chaos, but we have not yet embraced community. That's our charge. That's our calling. We have to find ways, still using the collective we, to work through that historic bereavement and reach for, struggle for community.
Some would argue, and I might be one of these, who argue that the experience of African-Americanness, of being African Americans in this nation, is a continual journey of mourning. We go from King assassination, mass incarceration, police shooting of unarmed young men and women, Trump's election. I mean, it's a continual state of the frustration of our hopes and dreams to be, this is my interpretation, you may not say this, but this is my interpretation, to be equal citizens in this nation. And so how would you respond to You may agree or disagree, but give me your response to that. James Baldwin says, to be black and conscious is to be in a consistent state of rage. That's a paraphrase of what he said.
Yes.
But it's rage and grief, and so give me your sense.
I think there's a passage somewhere in the Psalms about the heathen rage.
Mm-hmm. And imagine vain things.
Yes. There is the reality of rage that's undeniable. But I think what we have to struggle with is what to do with the rage, and what do we allow the rage to do to us. Mm-hmm. If it becomes a pushing, a calling, a striving to go beyond the rage, that's one thing. But if we become consumed by the rage, then we are rendered practically unfit for service. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that we have to constantly strive against. The rage must not become new chains to bind us and enslave us and render us dangerous to ourselves and to others. We've got to go through the rage like a ship on a raging sea. And the great thing about the African American prophetic religious tradition, there are all kinds of messages and experiences and songs and music to help us through this rage. When the storms of life are raging, stand by me. And you can't sing through that song without learning something. I heard Adam Clayton Powell say once, Adam Clayton Powell Jr. on one occasion says that you cannot be in the black struggle without getting closer to God, even if you don't intend to. And Dr. W.B. Du Bois talked about finding melody and harmony in an unmelodious and ill-harmonizing world. That's the assignment of the prophet.
Let's go back. You said we've been here before, so yesterday you did a beautiful litany, including the Dred Scott decision. So I want to get that on tape for our viewers. So take us back.
If I can recall, I've not written that down. I could wonder what it was like for Dred Scott the morning after the Dred Scott decision. No black person has any rights that a white person is bound to respect. And if I could tune in on the wires of history and talk with Dred Scott, I would want him to tell us, what was it like that morning after that decision? However, at that very moment, there were some prophetic minds putting together the blueprint, not only for liberation, abolition, but for black colleges and universities. Mm-hmm. Between 1857 and 1870, Fisk University was born. Howard University was born. Morehouse College was born. Atlanta University was born, to name a few, and some of the great churches of this nation that still stand came into being during that moment of agony. Therefore, we should never, never surrender to the forces of evil and declare ourselves defeated simply because we lost, and I do say we lost, an election. Wow. We have lost many elections, but we have never surrendered. My grandfather was born, I think, in 1861, before emancipation. He was around in 1877, after the election of 1876. But he didn't give up. He became a deacon in his church. In the midst of all of that, my grandfather and the grandparents were around in 1883 when the Supreme Court killed the 1875 Civil Rights Bill. That's why I say we've been here before. My father was around in 1896 when the Supreme Court declared separate but equal. Therefore, the destiny of prophetic preaching was never dependent upon the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is dependent upon prophetic witness to maintain its legitimacy. But we have to be careful that we don't measure ourselves by the length of a decision issued by the Supreme Court. Our God is bigger than that. Our faith ought to be bigger than that. And these are not just words. I'm talking about deeds. By the time the people of Louisiana reached 1890 to 1900, there were 120,000, near 120,000 registered black voters in the state of Louisiana. By 1906, that number had been reduced to about 12 or 13,000. However, out of Louisiana came Gardner C. Taylor. So how can we give up when God keeps opening doors? Evil divides and God multiplies. We can't always count it because we are not trained to heaven's arithmetic.
Let's talk about the younger generation and your sense as to whether the younger generation is open to prophetic preaching.
You know, that's a very, very challenging question. I might be too old to answer that question. I'm maybe not young enough to answer it. And that's when I consult Otis III, OM3. He told me, he preached a few Sundays ago, mourning and mourning in America. I think there is a heart or soul longing on the one hand for prophetic preaching, but there is a comfort longing in all of us, in every generation, for comfortable settings, situations, jobs, and assignments. To use a biblical example, people don't go to seminary expecting a Nineveh assignment and will resist it. as much as possible. We go to seminary wishing for and praying for another kind of assignment, an assignment that provides all of the support systems and a cooperative board and a business meeting that's altogether peaceful and endorsing the vision and giving a good salary and incremental, raises along the way, and you're not expecting the vision to be challenged or attacked or even killed for a moment. I remember when I was in seminary, one of our lecturers, who was a pastor, said to us, when you go to a new assignment, church in that instance, but it need not be a church, the first year you are glorified. The second year you are criticized. The third year you might be crucified. The fourth year you might even be buried. But if you can rise on the fifth year, you can go on to do ministry. Doesn't quite come in that succession, but it's bound to come somewhere along the way. And I think the seminary can help prepare us for all of those moments of ministry, and especially equip us not for popularity, but for principled prophetic leadership. And that's a great challenge. I've said it many times, prophetic preaching can get you killed. I say the same thing about nonviolence. It will not keep you from being killed, but it will keep you from being a killer. And that's important. It will not keep you from seeing lynchings and assassinations, but it will keep you from being a part of the lynching. And it will keep you from cheering the assassination. And seminaries, I think, have the responsibility as best they can to equip us for moments and zones of agony. But with the spiritual equipment and the intellectual, the academic tools and equipment to build in the midst of all of this. It's never an even course, so to speak, not without some missteps and some ups and downs and dangers, toils and snares, but I think we have to keep working at it. We have to keep building a curriculum that speaks to that kind of reality, so that when a woman or a man meets that circumstance, they can say, oh, my Old Testament professor said this one day in class, and I didn't listen too well, but I remember. And this is what she was talking about. I heard a sermon in seminary, and it walked me through with a comparison of Harry Emerson Fosdick's sermon or Dr. King's sermon on the night of the beginning of the Montgomery bus protest. When he said, if you will protest with dignity and with love, when the historians of the future write the story, they will have to pause and say, here lived a great people. black people who injected new meaning into the veins of civilization. And then he said, that is our calling, and that is our overwhelming responsibility. And he sat down. And that's what he followed for the next decade. And we have to revisit that. We have to revisit the letter from a Birmingham jail. And especially, I think, the letter from the Reidsville, Georgia prison, which is not as well known as the letter from a Birmingham jail.
So what about that letter from the Reidsville prison that really stands out to you?
One, and I pardon the personal reference, I was involved in the movement that caused him to end up in Reidsville prison. Everybody else was released. We negotiated that, and then came an unexpected bombshell from Decatur, Georgia, DeKalb County, that said, Dr. King, you have violated your probation, a probation he didn't know he had. He had been given a ticket for a minor traffic violation, and the judge said, and the prosecutor said, he was on 1 year probation for that violation. Therefore, going to jail with the students, his probation that he didn't know he had was automatically revoked, and he was now required to go to prison, state prison, 4 months, hard labor, 4 months public works, which really meant sending Dr. King to a Georgia chain gang for 4 months. And they rushed him in the middle of the night, early morning hours, with chains on his body, literally, and locked him up in the Reidsville prison. One of the first things he did when he got there was to write a letter to Mrs. King. And in that letter, he said many things. He asked her to bring him on her first visit 9 books, including the Bible, a dictionary, and a thesaurus. Increasing Your Word Power, he said, was the title of the book. Now, he didn't say anything about a lawyer or a bondsman, but he asked for those books and 18 sermons he had published and told her exactly where to find them. There's a paragraph in that letter, a short paragraph, which said, I have the faith to believe that the suffering coming to our family now will somehow make Atlanta a better city, Georgia a better state, and America a better nation. Just how, I do not yet know, but I have the faith to believe that it will. 8 days later, he was released because of the intervention of both Senator Kennedy, who was running for president, and Robert Kennedy, his campaign director. Senator Kennedy called Mrs. King. Robert Kennedy called the judge. He was released. Now, fast forward. The following year, a new mayor of Atlanta was elected, who was pushed, to borrow the words of Lerone Bennett, he was forced into greatness because of the African American vote. He was succeeded by another mayor who was even forced to do greater things. And then came Maynard Jackson, Andrew Young, Bill Campbell, the first female mayor of a major southern city, Mayor Shirley, and now Kareem, Reed, all of that came out of that moment of suffering and liberation. Kennedy literally won the election because of taking the risk to stand with Dr. King. Journalists and historians have not yet told the full truth on that, but the record shows it. Now, give me another minute. After that incident, Daddy King shifted his endorsement from Nixon to Kennedy, and so did a lot of other people. A group of activists in the campaign printed 11 million pieces of literature dealing with this incident and distributed those pieces of literature in Atlanta, Chicago, New York, St. Louis, Cleveland, California, San Francisco, LA, and all of the major urban centers in America through the black church. And Kennedy won by, according to one count, less than a half vote per precinct. Popular vote about 113,000. He became president of the United States from the jail cell of Martin Luther King Jr. And the prophet in jail advanced the career of the politician to the White House. There are many other things we could say about that, but on the foundation that was laid in that movement, at least 5 presidents have been elected. So, if you go back, Dr. Thomas, and look at the prophetic moment of the fall of 1960, the autumn of 1960, 5 presidents have come out of that. Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, Clinton, and President Obama. Then, if this moment of protest, suffering, and marching and jailing had the capacity to bring forth 5 presidents, why should we become despondent and give up on one who was elected November 8th? There is too much greatness for us to give up because of what we now interpret as one tragedy, or even a series of tragedies. This is an example, I think, of the risk and the results of prophetic preaching and leadership.
For my last question, we've been having conversation about this brand new PhD program in African American preaching, and I'd like to get your sense of how you feel about it. And of course, I know you told me, but I'd like, just to talk about what it means to you and what it means to our community, our nation, and the world.
First of all, I want to thank you for your leadership and vision in setting forth this kind of experience at the seminary level with this kind of content and inviting the kind of persons who will participate in this movement. We cannot measure the greatness of this program, but seeing it far off, we know. that you could preach right there. I think that this is going to become one of the significant, and that's too small a word, events or visions or happenings in seminary education that's going to inform the 21st century. From that springboard, from that platform, those individuals will go forth into the world. Many of them, if not most of them, are already doing wonderful things. The whole church and the whole realm of spirituality will be enriched by this initiative. I won't be around to see all of the results of this, but that's not important. For as I face sunset, you have introduced a new day begun, a rising sun, and we are all indebted to you. And we thank God for those who will participate and look forward to what will flow from this new spring of hope in seminary education.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that affirmation. And my concluding comments to you are that there is something that is structural about the Pope, for example, that's in us, that yes, we look for mothers and we look for fathers, people who stand as the best, who have our best interests, who have our best heart, who have loved and cared for us. And so you have functioned as a father to a lot of us. And we want to thank you, we want to bless you. And though in the Baptist tradition we don't have popes, but we do have the same need for a parent or parents or guides or chaperones, tour guides, people who've been further up the road than we have, who are able to say, this is what it is, or watch this, or this is our tradition, or don't forget this, or don't forget that. And so you have been father to many of us. And so we thank you, we bless you, we pray that your influence increase, that you continue for many years. I know you talked about sunset, for many, many years, to advise, to pray for, to encourage, to lift. And thank you for this interview. We will share this because I think it's an interview for this moment and for this hour. And we're going to spread it far and wide. So thank you, and we bless you.
Thank you. An honor to share this moment with you.
Thanks.